Okay, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Paul Hobart. Paul began his Federal General Accounting Office career in 2007. He's an assistant director in Homeland Security and Justice Team, where he had worked on a wide variety of issues, including maritime safety, supply chain security, criminal infrastructure protection, aviation security, law enforcement oversight, and immigration enforcement. He has authored journal articles on cargo security and presented on supply chain security issues to both industry and foreign governments. Paul has a Master of Public Affairs degree from the University of Texas and a Bachelor of Arts degree in Political Science and International Development Studies from McGill University, Montreal, Canada. Please help me welcome Paul Hobart.
Afternoon, y'all. Says we're on. Can you hear me? Okay. I'm from the federal government, and I'm here to help. Which president said that? Reagan. Was that a positive comment or a negative comment? Negative. I've got an hour to try to change your mind. And I know our next panel discussion will have a DHS representative too, so he'll hopefully help me in that regard. But as Glenn said, I'm from the Government Accountability Office. I do supply chain research and investigations for the U.S. Congress. I'm here with my partner, Adam Kuvion. He's a senior analyst in charge. He'll be covering some of the material as well today. And we've really got three main things we want to go through. One, who am I? What do I do? Why is the Government Accountability Office speaking to me today? And then we're going to walk through the supply chain. So we've had a lot of discussions today, almost at the firm level, with HR issues recently, mass shootings, workplace. We're going to go all the way up to security at the international supply chain, starting overseas, taking you on a journey domestically. Okay. And we're going to be focusing on anti-terrorism at that high level. If we have a terrorist event like we've seen in the past, supply chain will stop. There's no protection. It would take a while to get security and trade flowing again. And we're going to walk you through a number of different programs that the federal government has to enhance supply chain security. Okay. So the background, what is GAO? I mentioned it a little bit. We do research and investigation for the U.S. Congress. And we're nonpartisan, non-ideological, and independent. There's been a theme running through our presentations today on the importance of data and objectivity, and that's what we bring to the U.S. Congress. We work for both sides of the aisle. We work for the ranking member of committees. We work for the chair of committees, Republicans and Democrats, both houses. We present the facts as they are. And usually this means that a committee likes some of what we say, and some of it they're not so happy with, but we report the facts. And that's our main bread and butter product. We issue reports for Congress. We do reviews of different programs that we're talking about. It takes us about a year. And we make recommendations to agencies on how to improve their programs. So in this case, it's about supply chain security, but we cover all areas of the federal government. And we have a pretty decent return on investment. Any guess on, for every dollar we spend, what the taxpayer gets back? Throw out a number. More than 7 cents, definitely not zero. $145 over the past 5 years has been our average. So for every dollar that we spend, we return $145. And that's through our reviews of programs. We find ways for cost savings, ways to gain efficiencies. That's one of the reasons why our budget keeps improving, right? Because both sides of the aisle can agree that finding ways to save taxpayer dollars is in everyone's best interest. Okay. So supply chain. Y'all are very familiar with this, but there's two main goals that the federal government has. It's supply chain security, while at the same time facilitating trade. Okay. The only way to buy down risk completely is to stop trade. That's not a feasible option. Now, Department of Homeland Security, that's the main agency responsible, and it has a multi-layered security strategy. There's not one program in place to secure the supply chain. there needs to be some overlap and redundancies and coordination to ensure that if a bad actor gets through one layer, there's other layers that will intercept that bad actor. And this is a graphic depiction of the different agencies involved, and it's only some of those agencies, right? So DHS, there's multiple components, and they cover different parts of the supply chain. We'll walk through some of this. There's Coast Guard, there's ICE, there's CBP. Within DOJ, there's FBI, Department of Transportation, many different players, lots of coordination points. I want to bring your attention to that top blue bar. And the federal government, and DHS in particular, only has direct authority domestically. So 12 miles outside our exclusive economic zone from our ports. And it takes international agreements and cooperation to implement programs to ensure security for those parts of the supply chain that are overseas. So something to keep in mind as we go forward. Okay. How many of you are familiar with a customs trade partnership against terrorism? How many of you are members? Companies are members. Okay. Adam Kuvian, I'm going to introduce now, ask him up. He's a senior analyst in charge, and he's actually conducted reviews of this program most recently. He's going to walk through some of what GIO has done and what we found.
Thank you, Paul. Unlike my colleague, I'm going to hide behind the podium here for a minute so I can consult my notes. Thanks. And, I guess Paul decided early on before our presentation here, just given the unbridled glamour and excitement of the federal government auditing world, it was going to take two of us to handle our presentation here. So we're going to just tag team this a bit. So as you can see by the slide up here, Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, which some of you are familiar with or indicated membership in, some of you may be less familiar. This is a program going back to the post 9/11, late 2001, 2002 timeframe that CBP initiated as kind of one of its core tenets of meeting that goal, that mission of facilitating the free flow of commerce and trade, while also helping to ensure homeland security and security of cargo and shipments entering and being transported throughout the country. So at last check, there were over 11,000 unique business entities that were members in the program, and that represents over half the monetary value of cargo being imported into the U.S. And to become members of this program, businesses must agree to kind of a broad range of security measures, which CBP refers to as minimum security criteria, which vary by industry type, agree to kind of follow best practices and enhance security procedures and address security gaps. We'll talk a little bit more about kind of the membership and application process shortly. In exchange for that membership, then companies are to receive various benefits from CBP, such as reducing the number of CBP examinations of their cargo, front-of-the-line privileges for inspections, for highway carriers that could mean access to what are called the free and secure trade lanes or fast lanes at some of the land borders, or access to a CBP supply chain security specialist, which is official working for CBP to answer questions and, help them out with the program there. So, slide. So kind of a quick overview of the process by which businesses become members of CTPAT. Begin with application and eligibility. Business entity submits an application for CTPAT membership, including a supply chain security profile that describes their security practices. Supply chain security specialist is then assigned and determines if the applicant meets minimum eligibility requirements. Then the security specialist vets their application, which just means they review the entity's compliance with custom laws and regulations and identify any histories of violations that they may have. Certification process then Within 90 days of receipt of the entity's supply chain security profile, the specialist determines whether they have adequately addressed the minimum security criteria for membership. If it's approved, the business is then certified as a CTPAT member and eligible to begin receiving benefits. Validation process, this is kind of one of the bigger, more important steps. Within a year of that certification, the supply chain security specialist validates security measures outlined in the security profile. This occurs through a site visit to the member's location, and if the business is an importer, that also involves at least one visit to one foreign supply chain partner site. Then after this, annually, every year, once a member is validated, they undergo an annual review of eligibility status and vetting and certification process. Again, every 4 years, they undergo a revalidation process of supply chain security practices as is required through the Safe Port Act. So it's a little bit about CTPAT and our reviews, sort of where our work has come into play. As you can see, we've done a number of program reviews, assessments over the years, either specifically focused on CTPAT or along with other CBP supply chain security programs. Some of the things we've found, we've learned about the program over the years, going back to the early days of the program, there were issues with no initial human capital plans or strategic planning. In an effort to sort of rapidly implement the program early on and enroll participants, there was more of a short-term planning focus. So we recommended then that CBP develop, strategic plans to establish accountability and human capital plans that would clearly describe how they recruit and train and retain staff. Limited performance measurement and strategic planning. We made recommendations about the need for CBP to measure and report on the benefits of the program, because if industry members need to know that they're going to see some benefit, right, from the program if they're going to commit the time and resources to be involved. There were some challenges verifying security practices. In the early years, we noted that validations only examined a few of the security measures that were outlined in the members' security profiles. So we recommended that CBP develop guidelines for those practices, and that they also, as a result of some of our work, they developed a tiered system of benefits, which, if you're familiar with the program, I won't go into a lot of detail about, but there's a Tier 1, Tier 2, and Tier 3, depending on the level of security and the number of best practices followed and things of that nature that confer higher levels of benefits as your tier level rises. And they also lacked kind of a systematic process to ensure that members were taking actions that the CBP supply chain specialists recommended in their validation reports, which they submitted back to the companies when they conducted their initial validation. One other issue that I do want to talk about is problems with data or information systems. In the earlier years of some of our reviews, they faced challenges in meeting their security validation responsibilities because some of the data in their internal systems were lacking. In around 2015, CBP rolled out what they called the Web Portal 2.0, and the system they call Portal is used for companies use it to submit their applications, their security processes and procedures, and other reports and information that CBP requires. They also use it for their own internal record keeping, keeping track of validations that need to be conducted, et cetera. There were problems with that system that made the electronic keeping difficult and harder to complete security validations in a timely and efficient manner. So they conducted analyses to kind of identify those problems and did develop plans to address and rectify a lot of those. Another kind of key issue was that For years, CBP has tracked and reported data on the extent to which members were receiving benefits, such as, the likelihood of a CTPAT member versus a non-member of CTPAT to have their cargo inspected or held at a port. However, it was difficult to really determine the extent to which folks were receiving these benefits because of problems with their data. And what I mean by that is, one example, when we were reviewing the data as part of our program reviews, and this was in the report that was we issued back in 2017, we noted that we were seeing things like CTPAT member shipments weren't consistently experiencing lower exam rates or lower hold rates when compared to non-members across different modes of transportation, or sometimes Tier 2 members weren't receiving lower exam or hold rates when compared to Tier 1 members, which they should have been per the benefits of the program. So as we dug into that and talked with CBP officials and asked questions about these things, eventually they noted that there appeared to be errors in the data, errors in some of the formulas used to calculate some of these performance measures. The system had been in testing mode for a long time, and formal requirements were never really developed or finalized. So we reported on that. Since then, CTPAT has conducted a root cause analysis of those data system issues and revised their calculations to correct some of those problems. We have not gone back and independently verified the results of the new data analyses yet, but we do know that that sort of root cause analysis to identify those problems, has taken place. One other quick thing I'll mention, the response to COVID. Some recent work that we did, we found that from March of 2020 to April of 2022, supply chain security specialists, of course, couldn't travel to conduct security validations at different sites. So that led to backlogs in some of their validation work. So we know CTPAT hired additional staff and kind of trained them up to help address that backlog. And they also developed a process where they did the revalidations virtually through video conferences. And those two practices together kind of helped to reduce backlogs. Over the years, we've made over 15 recommendations in total to CBP on the CTPAT program. And, through time, they've implemented those and, made progress to address those issues. Before I move on, I will point out at the bottom, you'll see GAO 03770, et cetera. Those are some report numbers that that we're pulling this information from. So if you're interested, you can go to our website at gao.gov and search on report numbers or the topic of CTPAT and, look into any of that further if you are interested. One thing I want to point out specifically is generally when we're conducting these reviews, we do try to meet with industry officials whenever we can. We've regularly met with both industry associations and individual members of the CTPAT programs. This helps us to corroborate the practices that are going on and what it is that CBP is doing to run the program, to talk about the impact of CTPAT on security, about the benefits that are being received, and just to get members' perspectives on the validation procedures, which have all been really important to our work. We've got a couple of quotes you may or may not be able to read up on the board, that some information we pulled from our reviews. Folks have shared with us, some positive views on the CTPAT program, that they do like the benefits being received, that having access to staff, supply chain security specialists to answer questions and share information and listen to their concerns has been an appreciated benefit. We've also gathered information that, there was a desire for CTPAT to improve some of the benefits that are provided or add additional member benefits. And most recently in our report last year, they, some folks shared with us that they liked this virtual revalidation program that was taking place. They thought it was efficient and helpful and would like to see that continued, which started as a result of COVID. One other thing I'll mention, this kind of concludes our work on CTPAT. But our report was issued in May of 2021 from the Borders, Trade, and Immigration Institute through the University of Houston. This was through a DHS grant. They surveyed and reached out to thousands of CTPAT member businesses and got some responses, and a lot of responses indicating that the member companies believe that for the most part, benefits outweighed the costs or were at least equal to the cost of being members of the program, that the validation and revalidation process was challenging but necessary, and they understood its benefit to enhancing supply chain security, and that they also generally had positive views of the CBP staff, the supply chain security specialists that were there to kind of help navigate the program, as well as other CBP requirements and things of that nature. So that is on the CTPAT website. That's not GAO work, but it was something done. It's kind of a recent, pretty thorough overview of the program and of industry's perspective towards the program that's on the CTPAT website that can be accessed. So that's it on that program. So I will turn it back over to Paul.
Thanks, Adam. So the key takeaway from that CTPAT vignette, if you will, is we're asked by Congress to review programs, and we do that in an unbiased, unpolitical way. And in doing that, we look at data, we talk with agency officials, and we talk with y'all. We talk with the consumers of that particular program. And supply chain security, it's the folks in this room. Because DHS, CBP, Coast Guard, they could tell us how their program's running, but unless we get the perspectives from the industry, we're not going to get a true, complete picture of how that program's operating. Anybody seen the movie Office Space? There's been a few references to movies. Okay, the two Bobs. Like in a very loose way, that's what we do for Congress. We are the two Bobs, and we look for efficiencies in programs in the federal government. So we're going to talk about a few other programs and the role that industry has played in our reviews. Okay. So again, we're taking you on a journey from the overseas parts of the supply chain domestically, and we're going to talk about different modes. In the maritime mode, there's the Coast Guard. Now, everybody knows Coast Guard search and rescue, hurricane response, but they also have vital roles in port security too. And they actually go inspect foreign ports that trade with the United States, and they inspect their security measures. I'm actually going to leave this slide at that because we have a report that's forthcoming. Unfortunately, it doesn't come out till next week, so I can't talk about the findings and recommendations that we have there. But know that the Coast Guard is an important part of DHS's multi-layered security strategy. Okay. There's also a land-based program, the Container Security Initiative from CBP. And we have reviewed this several times over the years. And unlike the Coast Guard, which sends out inspectors to different places for only a week at a time, CBP will actually station officers overseas for multiple years. And they work with their host government counterparts to review and scan and inspect high-risk containers. They might do x-rays, they might use radiation portal monitors, look for nuclear material, they might even pop a lock and conduct physical inspections. And those pie charts there show some data that we crunched. And there's 61 CSI ports worldwide, and we found that many of the places CBP was at were not risky. And there were a lot of places that were risky where CBP was not at. And there could be some justifiable reasons for this. For example, CBP wanted to station its officers in one country. That country is a democracy. That country's parliament said no. US, you can't come in and have officers at our ports. In another case, the State Department said, no, CBP, you can't station officers at that port. It's too risky. It's not safe enough. But in many of the other locations, CBP had not analyzed risk data, again, the importance of looking at data, to determine the appropriate locations. Are the money we're spending on this program appropriate for the level of risk? So we made a recommendation to CBP that they assess their program based on risk. And they didn't change any of the other locations they were already at. but they expanded to 3 locations using the risk model they developed to respond to the recommendation that we made. And throughout the review of this program, CSI, we met with industry. We met with World Customs Organization. We traveled different CSI ports around the world. We met with industry, talked about their supply chain, talked about the security of their supply chain and how CBP impacted it. We included those reviews in our reports. Okay. There's an aviation component too. So just like Coast Guard's inspecting ports, CBP's inspecting containers, TSA is overseas looking at the safety and security of foreign airports. And we've reviewed this program and we found through looking at TSA's data that in about 25% of foreign airports, there were deficiencies in the air cargo security operations, so 25%. And TSA was working to mitigate those risks with the foreign governments and the airport authorities. Again, TSA cannot require that those deficiencies be resolved because they don't have jurisdiction in other countries. But they can put conditions on the aircraft that are flying to the United States, for example, requiring security guards on the tarmac when cargo is being loaded. The other program in that bullet, air cargo advanced screening, lots of cargo transported by air, and TSA works with CBP to do a risk assessment. And we found that they were exchanging the risk information that they had, but not all of it. They weren't doing it comprehensively. They weren't doing it in an efficient manner. So just like 9/11, there was different components, different agencies in the federal government that had different pieces of information. This was an example where we recommended different federal agencies need to be coordinating better on sharing risk information. And DHS implemented that recommendation that we made. This next program is probably one of the most influential that industry had on some of the recommendations we made in this space. And TSA can issue what it calls security directives. If there's a clear and present threat in a location, TSA can overnight change the security rules. And this is important because usually there's this big, long regulatory process to determine the aviation security requirements in place. Yes, it would be. So that's the captain of the port authority. This could be domestic, it could be international, but it's the same concept. So MARSEC level, it's a security level like code red, code yellow, code orange for in layman's terms, where for a particular place or a particular piece of cargo, there's additional security measures put in place. And I'll give you an example. So in 2017, there was a plot. There was an aircraft transporting cargo from Turkey to Australia. Okay. And the Australian authorities found pieces of a bomb, not assembled, disassembled on that plane. And it originated in Turkey. And TSA overnight issued a security directive with certain requirements for all cargo and aircraft flying to or through or over Turkey. Right? There was a clear and present threat, which it seems justifiable, right? We don't want planes falling out of the sky. We want the cargo safe. We don't want the supply chain being impacted. But when we met with air carriers that were responsible for implementing these security directives, that TSA did not adequately coordinate with them. They didn't always incorporate the ideas and suggestions and the logistics of the trade community. And different aircraft, different aviation companies told us that there was actually a negative effect from some of these security directives. Actually, TSA was making the security posture worse in some instances. Not intentionally, just by trying to get the security directive revised or issued as quickly as possible to protect the supply chain. They're having these unintended consequences. And this wasn't one or two air carriers that told us this, it was multiple. So we reported that to Congress, and we made a recommendation to TSA that you need to systematically incorporate the trade community's perspectives and concerns and seek feedback from them and do that in a systematic way. And TSA implemented our recommendation. Right? So security directives that are made now, and there's been many. Some of them are related to COVID. For example, those hit the news. But they have incorporated industry feedback before going live. So that's kind of some of the key overseas programs that we've looked into in recent years, but there's also domestic angle. So CBP has cargo inspection domestically, not just overseas in the Container Security Initiative. And we looked at non-containerized cargo in the last couple of years. Containerized cargo, that's that top picture. That's the nice, pretty boxes that are standardized. The bottom is non-containerized, and that's about a third of all cargo. And it could be crated cargo like this, but it could also be petroleum, salt, grain, and it's a lot harder to secure that crated cargo because they're oddly shaped, but you can still conceal things in them. Those containers on the first picture, you can put those through a standardized X-ray machine at a port, real easy. The bottom ones, not so much. And CBP had minimum security guidelines at domestic ports for inspecting those crated cargo. If it was high risk based on their algorithm, there's certain steps that ports had to take. But when we met with industry, they told us that different ports were implementing that minimum security requirement in very different ways. And those quotes show that trade was actually being diverted to different ports that had less stringent security requirements for crated cargo. And that's really, there's two effects of that. First, a bad actor that knew that information could be going to the port with less stringent security requirements. That's not something anyone wants. But then two, the legitimate cargo is being screened perhaps unnecessarily so at some other ports. And if you have to divert to save time, that's a cost to industry too. And we recommended to CBP, hey, develop some guidance for these ports. It's better for the security posture of the United States if there's consistency across domestic ports. And it's better for industry too. That's one thing we hear over and over from industry is the federal government needs to have consistent standards and consistent application of those standards so we know what the security posture is, regardless of whether we're operating on the West Coast, LA Long Beach, New York, Newark, different airports across the country where we're importing things. And just recently, we closed this recommendation as implemented. And that's a goal we have at GAO. We not only make recommendations to agencies to improve government operations, but we track them. And we have a goal of closing 80% of our recommendations within 4 years of making them. And we're usually pretty close to that. Sometimes we're a little over, sometimes a little under, but we get pretty close. Okay. TWIC, anybody familiar with the TWIC program? Okay, I thought you might with the MARSEC comment. So Transportation Workers Identification Card, this is at maritime ports. And to get unescorted access to a domestic port that has some higher security requirements, you need a background check and biometrics. And industry has consistently raised concerns about this program to us, and we've raised concerns too. So you might guess I'm kind of the nerdy analytical type. I do data, I talk to people, but we also have a GAO investigative unit. They do red teaming, and we did some of that for this program, where you actually get an ID card to enter a port facility. And our investigators, they made counterfeit ID cards. They submitted fake background checks and biometrics and got access to legitimate cards that way. And they were able to gain access to different ports around the country when they shouldn't have, right? So we reported in GAO speak, that's an internal controls breakdown, right? But it has security implications. And we made recommendations for TSA and DHS, because the Coast Guard's involved too, to improve its security posture, change some of its internal controls procedures. And throughout all these reviews over the last 20 years, we've met with industry and we've raised those concerns in our reports. So we're a conduit of information, unbiased information to the US Congress. We've also reviewed CBP land ports of entry. You'll see up here, there's some contraband that's discovered. And this was more of a data grab for us. We didn't coordinate with industry as much here, but we found that CBP had not updated its policies for almost 20 years. So it hadn't even factored into its standard operating procedures key threats like fentanyl. And there's actually guidance that CBP has given itself that said we should be updating these policies more frequently. And that's a recommendation we made. CBP is in the process of addressing that. They've developed a Tiger team to look into that. Chemical facilities are also another key area the federal government's involved in. So there's the Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency. And if you have certain threshold quantities of dangerous chemicals, you're required to implement certain security procedures. But that's not the only game in town. This graphic up here is pretty busy. What I want you to focus on is that facility by the water. And there's 5 little icons there. And those 5 icons, that represents 5 different government programs that that facility has to implement. EPA, DOT, TSA, Coast Guard, all requiring some type of security measures to be put into place. And this is a common theme we hear from industry is there's government programs, and by themselves they're good, but they could do better if they were coordinating with each other. And that's some of the quotes that we took from our report here. That's what we heard from industry. And we found this as an issue. There's duplication, there's overlap across the federal government. This has an implication for government resources, because if you have EPA and DHS coming in and conducting similar inspections, finding similar things, that's not an efficient use of resources. Is that a good use of resources for the facility either? No, the facility has to work extra time to meet requirements for all 5 of those programs. And that's a real facility. The connections between the facilities are less illustrative. But we actually dug into data, government data, and found facilities where they were covered by multiple programs. We made a recommendation for DHS to develop a list of common actions a facility could use to meet requirements across multiple programs. It creates efficiency for the industry, creates efficiency for inspectors across these different programs. And DHS implemented that recommendation. Okay. The last program I'll talk about is surface transportation. This is last mile. TSA service inspectors, that's the cadre that works on this issue. And service inspectors, that's a little bit of a misnomer because mostly they don't do inspections. They inspect rail, but there's also a lot of outreach and education that goes on. And just like some of the other themes that we've raised today and the programs we talked about earlier, is TSA was dedicated to this area, but it wasn't allocating resources based on risk. Right? Didn't always go to the high risk modes, didn't always go to the high risk locations. So a common theme in our reports is use risk-based data and information to spend government resources. And throughout this, we met with different members of industry. We observed TSA providing outreach to highway over-the-road providers. Again, to see how the government was actually implementing these programs and the impact on industry.